Hi everyone, today we're going to be discussing moral conviction. The progenitor of this research is Linda Skitka. She's a psychologist at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and she runs research programs on social, political, and moral psychology. Skitka starts off by talking about Greta Thunberg as an example of how moral conviction can affect moral action. So, feeling fed up with the record heat waves and forest fires in Sweden, Thunberg single-handedly launched a school strike by protesting every day outside of the parliament in Stockholm against climate change. Her motivation was moral, so as Skitka puts it, her position on climate change is a reflection of her fundamental beliefs about right and wrong, good and evil. These beliefs, according to Skitka, create a sense of responsibility, if not a compulsion, to do something in support of them. The example of Greta Thunberg seems to show that moral principles sometimes have really huge effects on our action. But of course, this is a controversial claim in moral psychology. So Stanley Milgram argued that situations better explain people's moral behavior than their moral convictions. Milgram recruited people for a learning experiment where they were supposed to shock another participant, who happened to be an unseen confederate of the experimenters, whenever they got a question wrong. The experimenters asked participants to keep increasing the shock, even to a point where the unseen confederate was screaming in pain and demanding to be let out. In these experiments, about 66% of people administered apparently severe shocks. I've linked to a detailed recreation of this experiment in the description below. But Milgram's basic point is that maybe moral principles do not have the impact that we think they do. Instead, it's mostly situations that cause people to act. So the question is, how do we reconcile these psychological findings with the example of somebody like Greta Thunberg, somebody who dedicates their life to the service of their moral principles? This program in moral conviction research gives us what might be an answer. Milgram did not ask participants whether they considered their actions in the experiment to be a moral concern. And according to Skitka, this is a big deal. So, as she says, we argue that to know whether people are willing to sacrifice their moral beliefs to obey authorities, or whether a vote is primarily based on moral or other concerns, one must first ask those people whether their moral concerns are relevant to the situation or issue in the first place. So this, of course, this approach to studying moral judgment is different from other ways of defining morality, where we try and determine what morality is a priori. So social domain theory, which we've discussed in this class, defines morality as a judgment that's concerned with welfare, rights, etc., and it has a few other conceptual requirements. And moral foundations theory defines morality as anything that plays a functional role in regulating selfishness and making social life possible. But this approach that we see from the moral conviction researchers is different. So researchers working on moral conviction start by asking people whether they see their position on a given issue as a reflection of their personal moral beliefs and convictions. The idea is, let people define for themselves what counts as moral to them, and then figure out what the interesting connections are between moral judgments and other kinds of psychologically relevant phenomena after that. Now, there are a few key assumptions built into this moral conviction research. The first is that people can access and report the degree to which their attitudes reflect their core moral convictions. And so the basic idea here is that people's moral convictions are fairly transparent to them. They can report which things they consider to be moral issues and which things they do not. Now, the second is that perceptions of morality are a matter of degree rather than just a matter of kind. So people may have issues about which they have different levels of moralization, some of which are really key to their moral views and key to their moral identity, and others which are more peripheral or somewhat less moralized. Moral conviction research is supported by social domain theory, which suggests that people make a clear distinction between preferences, social conventions, and moral concerns. On the moral conviction researcher's perspective, morality is a meta-perception people have about some of their decisions, choices, judgments, and attitudes that can vary in strength. So they have a bunch of decisions, choices, judgments, and attitudes. There's a particular way they can see those things that constitutes moral conviction. Of course, it's important to understand how moral conviction is actually measured and operationalized. Moral conviction is usually measured using self-report measures. So people may not be able to explain why they believe that an attitude is moral on this view, but they easily recognize whether an issue reflects their moral convictions or not. Now, moral conviction is separable from attitude strength. That is, it's not simply a matter of how strongly you believe something. It's also separable from attitude certainty. So that is, it's not simply a measure of how certain you are about something. Instead, moral conviction is its own psychological construct that predicts the extent to which people believe that an issue is universally true, objectively true, authority independent, motivating and obligatory, and resistant to social influence. So on these next few slides, I'm going to go over a few of the different facets of moral conviction and talk a bit about the research that supports them. So people perceive morally convicted attitudes as objectively true, and they refer to facts that are grounded in fundamental truths about reality that would exist even if we did not recognize them. And they also perceive morally convicted attitudes as universally true. So that is, they refer to facts that apply across time, places, and culture, right? So anytime we have an attitude with moral conviction, these are some attendant facets of that moral conviction. If I think, for example, that murder is wrong and I have a moral conviction about it, I don't think of it as just like a mere preference where, I don't happen to want to murder, right? If instead I think, no, it is wrong, then I will tend to think that it is wrong in virtue of facts that exist independent of me, and that it is wrong across time, places, and cultures. It's not just a reflection of what we happen to conventionally believe here. So Morgan and Skitka 2020 had a bunch of participants report their degrees of moral conviction on many issues, as well as the degree to which they perceived their position to be objectively true and universally applicable. Moral conviction predicted perceived objectivity and universality, and this was true even controlling for attitude strength. So again, it wasn't just a matter of how strongly somebody believes something. This is a particular way of viewing one's own moral beliefs, right? It's a kind of meta-ethical attitude, a meta-cognitive attitude about one's own attitudes. So it's not merely just a measure of strength. Another facet of moral conviction is authority independence. So moral convictions are not dependent on authorities. That is, they don't depend on any person's say-so for them being true. So Skitka points to some evidence here regarding when the Supreme Court upheld Oregon's right to die legislation. What they found was that people's strength of moral conviction about physician-assisted suicide was the strongest predictor of their perceptions of the fairness of that decision, rather than their background beliefs about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court in general. And in fact, we might see a corollary of this when the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade. The perception of the Supreme Court's legitimacy went down as a result of that judgment, rather than the perception of its legitimacy supporting that judgment. So people will reject authorities, and they will reject the rule of law when the outcomes of those authorities' decisions violate their moral convictions. Another aspect of moral conviction is peer independence. So moral convictions are not dependent on social conventions or the agreement of one's peers. People tend, of course, to conform to a majority group opinion, usually because going against the group would threaten their belonging in that group. However, When people have strong moral convictions, they actually prefer to distance themselves from attitudinally dissimilar others. So if somebody believes something very different from me and I have a moral conviction about what I believe, I don't want to be near that person, either in terms of social distance, that is having to work with them or live with them or interact with them on an everyday basis, or physical distance, that is being physically close to them. Now, given that people that have strong moral convictions don't want to be near people that they disagree with, this means that people in that scenario have little incentive to try to belong to this group that disagrees with them. And this is perhaps why people are so resistant to majority influence when they have a moral conviction. So as Skitka puts it, moral convictions inoculate people from pressures that usually lead them to defer to authorities, to the rule of law, or to pressures of majority influence. Now, a real key factor here for understanding moral conviction is that when people have a strong moral conviction, they're really concerned with whether that attitude gets implemented or not. That is, whether they get the end that they are searching for. What they're not as concerned with is the means by which it is obtained. So moral convictions are authority and consensus independent. And so people judge that the legitimacy of institutions is actually based on whether those institutions produce outcomes consistent with their convictions. So in one study that Skitka reports, participants reported their responses to the death of a criminal defendant, having been told that the defendant was either truly guilty, truly innocent, or maybe they were told that it was unclear whether the defendant was guilty or innocent. Half of the participants then were told that the defendant had died because of vigilante justice before the case went to trial. Whereas the other half were told that the defendant had died as a result of the death penalty after a fair trial. So notice that we have 6 groups here. I could be told that this defendant was truly guilty and told he'd been killed as a result of vigilante justice, right? Or I might be told that it was unclear whether he was guilty or innocent, and told that he was given the death penalty as a result of a fair trial, etc., etc. There's 6 combinations here. What they found was that participants with strong moral conviction about guilt or innocence, that is, people that were told that this person was truly guilty or truly innocent, thought that the outcome was equally fair or unfair, irrespective of whether it was the result of vigilantism or due process. So what really matters to people with moral convictions is not the process that we go through or the institutions that enact justice, right? Rather, what matters is the outcome, right? Justice is defined by its outcome and whether it matches our moral convictions, not the other way around. So moral conviction is also associated with political engagement and activism. When people have moral convictions, this is associated with perceivers of events feeling obligated to act on them. Now, the more morally convicted a person is about some issue, the less they'll have a choice about making a decision about that issue. It seems like if you have a low level of moral conviction, you're more likely to see something as a preference or as a social convention, right? And as a result, you may feel like you have some choice about whether to act one way or the other. But the more you start to moralize an issue and think of it as a fundamental part of your moral convictions, then you feel your decision space decrease. Suddenly, it doesn't seem like there's even a choice in the matter. This is just the right way to act. So moral convictions are, of course, associated with intentions to take part in activism. And in one study that Skitka reports, stronger moral conviction about the Hungarian refugee crisis a few years back predicted greater political activism and volunteerism on behalf of these refugees. Of course, moral conviction being the kind of thing that makes us feel like we don't have a choice but to act a certain way, this is the only right way to act, can also lead us to be quite intolerant. So moral convictions are, of course, perceived as objectively correct and universally applicable, Those who disagree with these then are just viewed as fundamentally wrong. And as a result, moral conviction is associated with intolerance to others who disagree, of course. So people with stronger moral convictions prefer, as I mentioned, greater social and physical distance from people that disagree. And moral convictions also predict greater prejudice, greater social media avoidance, and greater anger, incivility, and antagonism when people are faced with other people that do not share their moral convictions. However, Skitka points out some evidence that actually this link between many of these negative, intolerant aspects of moral conviction may be reduced. If people are induced into a more mindful state, they sometimes have this intolerance lessened. So, of course, moral conviction is also deeply related to emotion. It has, in fact, a stronger association with emotion than equally strong but other non-moral attitudes. So, of course, these emotions include a lot of the moral emotions. Skitka mentions anticipatory pride at having taken part in some activism or political project, or alternatively having done what you perceive to be the right thing, as well as anxiety that maybe your moral convictions will not be upheld, and anger or guilt when they in fact are not. So Skitka points to evidence from the Iraq War where people who had stronger moral convictions about that war had stronger positive and negative emotional reactions to the war, depending on whether they supported it or opposed it, as compared with people whose support or opposition was weaker in moral conviction. It's also worth thinking through how we might increase or decrease moral conviction. And here Skitka talks about moral recognition. So when one's initial attitude is perceived as a preference, moralization of that attitude requires a recognition of the possible moral significance of the attitude's object, right? So for example, eating meat is considered to be a preference by a lot of people. And to moralize meat eating, as a lot of vegetarians and vegans do, a person has to become aware of the moral significance of animals, right? Otherwise, one will just perceive this practice as a kind of preference, that one person has this preference, the other has that preference, but it's not really a moral issue. You have to be made aware of the moral significance of this issue in the first place. So such recognition, she says, usually involves recognition of harm, but also new emotional associations, such as disgust. Moral recognition, she says, is more likely to be cognitively effortful, deliberate, and elaborative, even when emotions are also involved. So this is trying to get somebody to recognize something as a moral issue actually involves reasoning with them a bit, right? And you may have to appeal to emotion sometimes, but you also have to give them reasons to believe that this thing you're talking about has moral significance in the first place. What she says does not work is moral shock tactics. So exposing people to disgust or anger-inducing information is unlikely, she says, to be sufficient to moralize pre-existing preferences. Now, given that moral conviction can sometimes have a dark side, that is, it makes us less tolerant of others who disagree with us, it makes us less likely to accept the results of a justice or a judicial process which we disagree with, right? Makes us more likely to accept vigilantism, right? We may wonder how we can, in some cases, reduce more people's moral convictions. So whether a person can be persuaded out of their moral convictions is, of course, a function of the type of persuasive message that they see. And Skitka reports a few bits of evidence, one way or the other, about the type of message that is effective at demoralizing people's attitudes on a given issue. So she says that non-moralized messages, that is, those that argue simply in terms of pragmatic concerns, are typically ineffective. But moralized messages, that is, arguments that are framed using deontological messaging, for example, are in fact more effective. And the same is true for messages that emphasize moral emotions like anger and disgust. So let's sum up here. Moral conviction, first of all, is not just attitude strength. It's not just a matter of how strongly you believe something. Instead, moral conviction is a type of meta-perception. It's a way of looking at your own attitudes. Moral convictions are perceived to be objectively and universally true, authority independent, and obligatory. And knowing the degree to which someone sees an issue as morally relevant has wide-ranging implications for their tolerance of others, their willingness to become politically engaged, or to compromise, as well as many other factors. Summing up, if we conceive of moral principles as moral convictions, it's pretty clear that they do have a strong role to play in motivating people's action. And if we're trying to study whether moral principles have an effect or whether it's merely a matter of situational factors, we have to actually ask people whether they believe that, whether they actually treat these attitudes they have as moral attitudes. Because it might be the case that in some cases they simply don't moralize the things that researchers expect.